Welcome to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Maxwell Cooper, and in this podcast series, I interview physicians, medical innovators, and entrepreneurs making an impact on healthcare. This podcast is produced by DaVinci Academy, a multimedia medical education company that provides podcasts, video courses, and digital textbooks. You can see more on our website, www.dviacademy.com, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/DaVinci Academy Med. This podcast is sponsored by Doc, the personal lending platform designed for doctors by doctors. Do you have some big expenses in the near future? Maybe you're moving, applying to residency or fellowship, fixing up your car or home, or starting a new practice. Doc believes that traditional lenders overestimate the risk of lending money to doctors, residents, and medical students, focusing too much on the challenges of their financial past and giving them insufficient credit for the promise of their financial future. Check out Doc's personal loan options at drlending.com/DaVinci. Hey everybody, welcome back to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm joined this week by Jani Tuomi, who is the co-founder of a company called Imaware, based out of Austin, Texas. So Jani, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be on your show.
Awesome. Well, maybe give the listeners a little bit of background about, I guess, first who you are, kind of where you went to school, what you studied, maybe some of your previous work experience, and then kind of maybe like a 30,000 foot overview of what Imaware is. We'll definitely dive more in deep, but just so they kind of have a general working overview.
Yeah, for sure. My name's Jani. I grew up in Northern Canada, where it snows half the year. My dad was in construction. My mom was in healthcare as a nurse. And I went to school for computer science. So I didn't spend the first 15 years of my career in healthcare, but it was, my family member getting ill that got me into healthcare. And then the way to do it felt like working with scientists and building a startup. So that became how Imaware, came to life in 2017. And Imaware offers at-home blood testing, and our goal is to offer tests that have equivalency to gold standard tests like phlebotomy. So kind of trying to bring real tests out to market, whereas some tests out there are still a little skeptical on the science, right?
Yeah, definitely. So most of the tests you guys are working with right now, are they like tests that, you could probably get at any doctor's office, or are you also working on some ones that maybe aren't as commonly used, if you will?
Yeah, so obviously when you're in a home setting, we want to miniaturize the blood requirements. So, tests like your cholesterol panel or your prediabetes A1C or inflammation or others actually only need about 3 to 5 drops of blood compared to going to the doctor's office and pulling, that entire vial. So we definitely have that menu of standard type tests. And then, we're starting to get into more advanced biomarkers. For example, we were the first company, I guess, to say, bringing out a test for at-home testing for lipoprotein A, which is a hidden heart risk factor. It's got genetic kind of components to it, and 1 in 5 people have elevated Lp(a) that is worth considering. We're getting into some of those, more advanced biomarkers, and as you probably know, there's hundreds, if not maybe even thousands, of data points that we can measure. So our job at Imaware is going to be to keep pushing the limits of what has been or what can be testable at home.
That's really awesome, and I'm excited to hear more about that. But I want to ask you about, so you trained in computer science, and then now you're working in a health startup, like you said. I guess maybe tell us. I've heard you talk about your story about your brother, how that kind of really inspired this and kind of really in some ways shifted gears for you.
Yeah. Well, nobody likes to have a family member get ill, and there's certainly nothing unique about my situation. As I've learned, a lot of people suffer with sort of conditions that people don't know about until it's too late, right? So my middle brother had a cancer that we discovered way too late, and thank God my mom was in healthcare, so she actually was the one to diagnose him after 9 months of doctors misdiagnosing him. And I'm not really trying to at all fault the doctors here. Sometimes they're working with the tools and the 5 minutes a year that they get with a patient, right? But it was that situation that led me, kind of serendipitously, to meet a doctor who had debunked Theranos, who had discovered the PSA biomarker, who had been working in small volume blood testing. Think of one drop or less. And that was the moment where, I felt like that type of PhD and the focus that they had on small volume blood testing, plus my consumer product knowledge in building out user experience tools, felt like we could merge those two and create a prevention oriented at home screening platform. So yeah, pretty much quit my job that day, and got to work with some really brilliant scientists in bringing out this platform.
That's amazing. So I'm curious, with your brother, I imagine you probably ended up finding it probably in the end that there may have been ways you could have found this earlier. And maybe that was kind of at least part of the thought of, going in this direction, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's funny. Hindsight, or I guess it's not so funny, but yeah, definitely hindsight was there looking back. There were some signs, some symptoms, and certainly, blood work would have indicated that, even 3 months beforehand, that there were some things going on with the immune system and stuff like that, that the doctors who then took over his situation once he was in ICU, they were running blood tests twice a day, looking at all kinds of biomarkers. And they were able to look at that and say, hey, these numbers here sort of popped up recently, but these numbers here, you might have found them as an early indicator even 3 or 6 months ago. So it was interesting to me that the doctors that were charged with healthcare or the prevention of illness didn't quite have the same tests that the sick care doctors, the ones who are now caring for the illness, they could run anything and everything. So that was sort of a motivator for me to say, well, why can't we take the tests that are run in this setting and start to bring them into the prevention setting? And so that the rest is history from there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring about the ICU specifically. I mean, really, anytime you're in the hospital, but especially the ICU, like there is so much data that is being collected on an ICU patient, from labs, at least often more than once a day, as you mentioned. And then, if they're on a ventilator, the ventilator settings, they're getting imaging, all this different data. But like you said, it's and unfortunately, in many cases, it's either too late or it's kind of makes you wonder if you'd had even half this level of data earlier, would this have led to maybe an earlier intervention that could have made a difference. So I imagine that's also kind of what sparked this thought as well, which is pretty cool. I guess how did you get in contact with this physician scientist who had debunked Theranos? That's and invented the PSA marker. Those are some pretty remarkable achievements there.
Yeah, I'm going to call it serendipity or the universe, things that you just, sometimes can't explain. But I was working in a digital consulting firm and we were building some, really cool digital tools for banks and insurance. And this doctor actually had wanted to work with this firm that we were at to start to create like an education platform on digital and mobile to help people understand that they can screen for tests, not to get diagnosed for things, but for screening. And so I actually took that, proposal on to go and meet this doctor and understand what he was trying to get accomplished. And really, it was the moment I was in his lab and I did that PSA test from phlebotomy and from fingerstick and experienced what it is that they were building and how, the one drop of blood from the fingerstick could quantitatively match the same data that was coming from phlebotomy on that custom ELISA. I learned all these things like in that 1 hour, and I'm like, oh my God, this is what's happening in a lab that nobody really knows about. So that was where I felt it was my job to then, kind of bring the product and customer experience angle to that and help them scale that message out, not just by creating education, but by actually bringing that test into the home. So yeah, basically we talked about it for an hour and the guy's like, yeah, it sounds like you know what you're talking about. I'm like, sounds like you know what you're talking about. So it was a match made in heaven, and the rest is then we went and did all the tough stuff, the fundraising and all the rest. So
that's really interesting. I mean, from a finger stick, so kind of it's similar to like how patients have been measuring their blood glucose at home, like if they're diabetic. That's amazing. Just even like a small drop of blood. Yeah, as these patients in the ICU or even inpatient, they get so many sticks and so many draws, and I mean, it's some patients even get anemia from it because we've drawn so much blood from them. So it's amazing that you could get the same kind of results, if you will, from just a small amount, like what diabetics have been doing for years.
Yeah, no, I think most people don't realize this, but when they started building out all the genetic tests like 23andMe and others, the technology and the chips had the same kind of explosive growth like computer chips did when we went, from 386 to 486 to Pentium and all that. And every year it seemed like it was getting twice as fast. So the information that could be pulled from blood and the amount of blood that was needed to pull that information was, evolutionary, just increasing every 18 months. And so you didn't really need these big vials of blood anymore. By as early as like 2017, you could get by with microliters or drops. That I hate to say that the Theranos vision was sort of there. Yes, a couple drops of blood has a lot of information, but instead of trying to measure 1,000 biomarkers like they had claimed, we can measure 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them right now. It's definitely, in my mind, something that's going to be possible one day as we get more and more advanced chips. But you don't just go from kind of 0 to 100 in healthcare like that. But we are making those progressive steps every year to 2, where you're able to analyze so much more information from that much less blood. So pretty soon, if as the consumerization of healthcare takes over, we should be demanding less and less blood be taken, less and less phlebotomy, and more types of tests that can be run, with less painful and less invasive methods.
That's awesome. So I guess maybe walk us through it a little bit. Who's your kind of main end user right now? Is it directly to patients themselves, or is it also, like clinics and hospital systems, and then I guess walk us through it. Like they obviously they take, a sample of blood and then they kind of pick what tests they want to do. So maybe walk us through how that the customer experience aspect works.
Yeah. This was something where I credit some really amazing business advisors that helped us along this journey. We started out as DTC originally, and so we were selling tests directly to consumer and offering that physician oversight model to help those patients that might have had questions. But DTC is a tough space. You're paying a lot of money to Google and Facebook and ads and things like that. You're trying to get the attention of a customer. And then you don't know if that customer will ever come back and buy your test. So, we kind of quickly learned that there's no way this business is going to survive if we're paying, $100 for ads to sell a $79 test. And that's kind of the economics on it, right? So what we did was during COVID, we started partnering with businesses and we offered COVID testing. And over the past 2 years now, businesses, digital health companies that, offer virtual at-home visits, they want at-home testing so they don't have to do a visit, then send the person off to a lab, patient service center, then come back and do another visit. They just want it all to be at home. So it's actually been more of, kind of timed with COVID that we actually also evolved into B2B. And so now we offer at-home testing integrated, through white label kits and full APIs and HIPAA compliant and SOC 2 compliant, capabilities to allow their patients to receive this at-home testing brand on their platform. So that's where we've really seen the biggest growth now. And I think the best part about that too is wrapping it around a clinical protocol provided by, a physician group that's helping you reduce heart disease, or a group that's helping you maintain wellness, means you actually have professional healthcare support to help you action those results, right? And so I think for us, that's very important. We want to offer the best tests, but it was really hard to also offer the best advice after. And so, we feel really good about partnering in that sense instead of trying to be the one-stop shop for everybody.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I mean, that seems like it was a very smart move to partner with essentially like telemedicine providers, especially during the pandemic when people were still trying to provide good care, but you're limited as far as if with a telemedicine visit in that regard. Now, I'm curious, do you guys do all the testing in house, or is that something that you use a third party for to run your lab tests for?
Yeah, we had some anti-Theranos kind of, I'll call them pillars in the way we built our business. And so what we didn't want to kick off with was owning our own lab, because of course that creates that sort of black box experience. And we didn't want to be in a situation where, we just weren't trusted. So we actually started off working with some CLIA certified labs, and then quickly learned that, not even all labs are created equal. So we started to, really accelerate the types of data that we wanted. We worked with our labs to up their game in essence, so that we looked at labs that were CLIA, that were CAP accredited. That's even a higher standard. And then we did additional even validation studies above and beyond to make sure that the labs knew that how they could process the samples collected at home, and to again continue to verify that it matched phlebotomy. And so we created a lab network of 5 trusted labs. They get audited, 3, 4, 5 times a year by either CAP Group or the CMS federal government. And now that we feel really good about where we're at with this, we've built some great lab partnerships along the way. We have a business decision to decide if we want to either tighten up in partnership or become exclusive with each other, or maybe even build our own lab. But right now we're focused on really just building out a test menu and the data behind it to make sure our partners can have that trust in our platform.
Very cool. That's I guess that's probably a great way to integrate in like quality control as well, like you said, to make sure that the labs are accurate, everything's run in a proper fashion in the lab. Just having, like you said, kind of professional partners that do that. I'm curious from a standpoint of going directly to the consumer. Can someone, if without even seeing a physician, go on your website and let's say they're worried about their heart risk, and they're like, hey, I don't have time, or my PCP can't see me for 6 months, which, as you know, is becoming unfortunately a more and more common thing these days. Can they kind of help? It seems like it could help someone take control of their own health, if you will.
Yeah, we are seeing kind of 3 audiences outside of the B2B types of people, that come to us for their communities. One is the people who are underinsured or not insured. It's pretty staggering to me that if you want a lipid panel and you go to any one of the big hospital systems, you're paying between $500 and $800 cash pay for that panel. And we offer the same exact test, again, with that venous to cap data that ensures quality for $79. So, there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, I was laid off, or I can't believe that my copay is more expensive than your test. Why wouldn't I just get it with you guys? Another is definitely, I think of even like our celiac disease test, the number of customers who are like, my doctor refuses to test me for celiac disease because, they just don't believe it. And so I just want to know for sure. So they will go ahead and order that test. And of course, we offer the 50 state and regulatory approved platform capabilities, physician oversight, and the reports that have been, vetted and reviewed by physicians so that, the information that's presented is accurate. And then you can take that result to your doctor. And the number of times, again, with celiac disease specifically, where patients would go and say, hey, look at this. I told you I had a celiac gene in my family, and it's sure enough, I have this elevated TTG biomarker. You need to help me with that, right? So yeah, those are kind of the scenarios where we see a lot of direct to consumer application.
Interesting. So I guess in those regard, who reviews their, like, if they, like you said, if they want to have like a physician opinion, do you guys have physicians that work at the company that would do that, or
Yeah,
is that something you kind of refer them to?
so we use independent physicians. Again, we don't want to be in a situation where Imaware doctors are ordering Imaware labs and then recommending more Imaware labs. There are companies who have gotten in trouble of being, basically lab ordered physicians, and so that's definitely not on the right side of regulatory guidance. So we use independent doctors. We use other telemedicine networks. We refer even customers who come to our website to go to some of our partner offerings where they can get the test and that holistic educational approach.
So I want to ask you about, I guess the reimbursement aspect of this. So it sounds like it's, for the most part, especially if a consumer buys it, it's essentially cash, like they pay directly out of pocket for it. If they do it through like a telemedicine visit, do they have insurance covered, or is it still are you still working in a like completely out of pocket payment model right now?
Yeah, for this year, we felt that it was just easier to bring in a cash pay model with some employers that we're in with their plans. Obviously, the employer behaves like the payer, so those employees get the test for free, and it's just part of their employer benefits program. We are seeing movement towards home testing being approved by insurance with CPT codes for reimbursement. So I think you'll see, us and other at-home testing companies who sort of pass the mustard be able to offer insurance covered at-home tests, probably much more broadly next year. And that we're definitely going to be going, to help that marketplace, because our tests are much more affordable than cash pay equivalents, and we think we can offer that kind of price and convenience benefit to patients who are on insurance too. So
That's interesting. Yeah, it sounds similar to the cost plus drugs company that Mark Cuban started. That, as you know, I talked with him about a few months ago. So that's pretty cool. I think he said the same thing where it was, at least for now, they weren't dealing with insurance because it's just so much more complicated. And I think that was something they're hoping to maybe roll out down the future. But it sounds like kind of this, labs, drugs, kind of the same type of thing with dealing with
well,
insurance.
it's funny you say that because I literally after I chatted with you, I was like, hey, Mark Cuban, cost plus testing company. Because he's onto something, right? The legacy system, has just sort of gotten bigger and maybe a little more expensive, and it definitely is under sort of attack from startups or newer methods, and you're seeing direct primary care and all these other mechanisms to try and sort of reduce the cost of healthcare, right? So I like what he's up to, and if he's listening, we'll do his at-home testing platform. But like I said, I think you're going to see a wave in the future where there's going to be a kind of a hybrid model where you're going to sometimes pay out of pocket for certain things. You're going to get your employer to pay for certain things, and then maybe for the most critical, life-altering, you might have insurance for that too. So, and then of course, obviously, we could probably talk about this part for an hour. You need all that data smashed together in one place, right? Because if you're getting DTC this and physician that and telemedicine that, and they're in 5 different systems, then what's the point, right? So
Yeah, definitely. One thing I wanted to ask you, I was just curious what your opinion would be, is why do you think that something like this hasn't been developed before? What barriers do you foresee that keeping something from this? Because it seems so intuitive, but yet it's been, as until now, like solutions like yours, it's so complicated to get some of these, like you said, these simple tests done that are critical for monitoring one's health. And I guess what's kind of how do you think you guys have been able to offer that as like a way around any of those barriers that may have existed before?
it's that's a tough question. I don't even know that I for sure have all the answers. I mean, we're trying our best and we are making headway. I think if you'd asked me that question before COVID, I would have said I don't think we've cracked the nut yet. So certainly COVID helped to empower patients to test themselves. I think that was the first time we really saw that at scale. Diabetics who are running tests are going to say, well, I prick my finger every day and no problem. But to see the government buy 2 billion rapid tests meant probably everybody plus or minus has done a self-collect nasopharyngeal or a rapid antigen test. So I think COVID really accelerated this space. And on top of that, the technology for telemedicine was actually ready at the same time. Basically, the internet, our pipeline, the software, the mobile apps, kind of like you had this beautiful convergence of tech being ready at the time as testing was moving into the home for COVID. And now the question is, well, if we did it for COVID, why can't we do it for other potential preventative diseases like just prediabetes? Let's unwind those 1/3 of people who have that A1C we can do just through diet and lifestyle. Heart disease, let's go after people who have slightly elevated lipids and triglycerides. We don't have to see them in the hospital even. And so I think you're seeing a market adoption for that, a consumer adoption because they don't want to go in a hospital, and a cost-cutting adoption from the systems that say, hey, we don't want to see these patients if they're generally healthy. So I think we're in this like perfect storm that necessarily didn't exist before COVID.
That's awesome. I'm curious, and you alluded to this, is there's all this data now that you are able to collect from patients. I guess, is there any plans that I'm aware on like tracking that data or providing some type of analysis either for the patients or kind of maybe even doing some research studies, if you will? I'm curious what you guys are essentially doing with the data.
Well, right now, the easy answer is it's our patients' data. So we don't sell it. We don't sort of mine it. We have a very, I would say probably the best terms of use in the industry around use of patient data. We are simply stewards of it. We are allowed, of course, to do kind of de-anonymized research on it. And one thing we did learn when we were doing a COVID study where we had patient opt-in in Houston, for example, people who had symptomatic COVID also happened to have some other elevated biomarkers that consistently showed up. And especially 2 years ago, that was sort of news to everybody because nobody obviously knew about COVID. But you started to hear about these words cytokines and then IL-6. And, we supported a study of 500 plus patients in and around the Houston area. And when they had severely symptomatic COVID, over 14 days of positive symptoms and PCR tests, they demonstrated these higher IL-6 cytokines. So those are types of insights now that's been published in, I think, Nature and JAMA too, that IL-6 is a predictor of severity and mortality in COVID. So, you're starting to see that when you have bigger data sets like that, you can marry them up in interesting ways. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that, kind of in the next 5 years. And we want to play our part, right? One thing I certainly see, and I'll just do a little shout out to my friends at Whoop, is, the connection between HRV and cortisol, and then, all the other markers of health inside that Whoop doesn't measure. So when I'm getting better HRV, I see my cortisol dropping. I see, male testosterone improving. So, there's these things are all connected. And it'd be great if we didn't have all these disparate systems measuring them and sort of independently making statements about them. It would be really nice if it was all connected. So that's our job, is to just contribute where we can. And, maybe it's a Apple-led ecosystem, or maybe it is an Imaware-led ecosystem that one day is able to consume all this and continue to make recommendations.
That's really interesting, especially the comment about the immune system. I think we're just scratching the surface, if you will, with what immune markers can tell us and all these different interleukins and cytokines and everything. And I'm curious if you guys have any kind of like labs that you're beta testing in that regard, like, things that you're looking at to, say, hey, like these aren't really regularly measured, but, these could be, very useful for monitoring people's health.
Yeah, I think the two that I continue to be most excited about for the future, obviously, is the one we chatted about, lipoprotein A. It's a hidden independent risk factor for heart disease. Bob Harper from that Biggest Loser show had a sudden heart attack at the gym. He was in great shape. Lipids seemed fine. And he had a heart attack at the gym. And it ended up that he had elevated LPA. And he became a, pretty outspoken proponent for LPA testing. So, where we can help in that space, we will definitely be doing our part. And then another one I think is, one of our other PhDs has just been looking at IL-6 for a few years now. And it sort of seems to be around all the time. And where it's, above sort of normal ranges, disease seems to manifest, so I think there's something there. Now, we have to also be careful to bring out actionable reports, right? So, if like CRP, for example, if you sort of cut your finger open or you have heart disease risk factor, your hs-CRP can be high. So that can be misleading in a way because it's not always sensitive enough to a certain function. So that's what we need to sort of make sure we get a good enough study set on. And that's why we like to partner with B2B companies who have lots of either experience or data or knowledge in that condition that they're actioning, so we can support them in that.
Interesting. Gotcha. Okay. I'm curious, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm, especially any like budding entrepreneurs in this space out there, I imagine you had to go through some regulatory hurdles, I guess, from the regulatory end. Maybe kind of walk us through. I imagine like HIPAA was something you had to contend with. And then, I imagine there were some other, in healthcare, there's always regulatory hurdles involved. So I'm curious, like what the main ones were you guys dealt with and how you overcame those.
Yeah. Well, healthcare is not an area where you can kind of apply Silicon Valley thinking. As much as I love the idea of an MVP and, let's let our customers break it and then we fix it and improve it. I mean, that certainly I used to do that for a lot of my career as a product manager. But in healthcare, I learned pretty quickly, thanks to some, again, great doctors and lawyers. They're like, you can get away with something for 5 months. But then, the federal government's got reach and they can go back in time and you can go to jail. So, we took those very seriously. And I'm really glad I got that guidance right from the start. And obviously, we were highly educated on what happened with Theranos. And so to that end, we kind of built it into the DNA of the company to always be above what I would call the regulatory standard. So you've got CLIA on the lab side. They mandate a certain standard. We wanted to use CAP accredited labs. So that automatically, just has a higher quality to the lab processing. higher, more stringent requirements, more audits, things like that. So that's the lab side, and that's generally governed by CMS. So that's the federal government arm there. Obviously, the FDA looks at things from a patient experience perspective. We've gotten a few letters from them, and we've always kept our language and tone in line with what clinicians would say. So they have been pretty responsive to saying things like, hey, you're saying this on your website, we'd prefer if you said that. And again, that's no problem. We don't need anybody at the FDA saying that we're making false claims. That goes against what we're up to. And then the states themselves also have requirements. Like California and New York have more stringent requirements than many of the other states out there. So I think the best thing that I learned in the advice I was given was try not to meet the minimum standard, because you're just going to find yourself in this position of not necessarily building for the right outcome. So we strive to beat that minimum outcome and always adhere to the more stringent outcome. So even when it came to HIPAA is just sort of a guidance. Like when people say they're HIPAA certified or HIPAA accredited, I mean, there's not really like an audit you go through. You have to self-report these things. So we decided to go and get SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, which is sort of like HIPAA on steroids. And you get an auditor, who's independent, who comes and just beats up your systems and processes and everything. And, there's an example of where I wonder if one day, they might sort of put HIPAA onto a little bit of steroids and say, we got all these digital companies out there, and I don't know if we should just have MVP patient portals out there without any password protection. I might be a bit exaggerating there, but my guidance to entrepreneurs is there's a lot of great resources out there. I'm here. There's a lot of us who've gone through this. It doesn't have to be hard, but I do recommend sort of making that investment of building a culture and DNA of excellence, not just the minimum standard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You said going kind of above and beyond, because then you're not only does it make you a better, company and a better product, but also, ensures you're not, maybe you made it in this kind of requirement. Then you said, you noticed that like California and New York had even higher requirements in some states. So I imagine that would have added more time and more inefficiencies having to go back and, make adjustments for that. So that's pretty cool. I'm curious from the legal standpoint. Like I imagine you probably met with, in addition to the regulatory aspects, you probably had to meet with a lot of lawyers about this. Like, for example, if, a patient gets a test done and like they don't look at it for, say they forget about it and they don't look at it for 2 months. And if they had looked at it, it would have saved their life. Or I realize that's probably an extreme example, but you know what I mean? Like, any type of like medical liability here, I wonder if that came into play at all, or if any of those types of issues came into play.
Definitely. I mean, the words on the report that we designed were literally critiqued down to placement of comma, of the word recommend versus consult versus you should, and what is our obligation versus your obligation, and terms of acceptance. Like the entire workflow had to be legally reviewed, because as much as we want to help people, you're absolutely right, exceptions happen, right? What happens if somebody doesn't get an email, or God forbid goes to spam, and they had relied on a home test because they couldn't afford a normal test? We've heard of some pretty crazy scenarios. We've dealt with some personally where just scenarios you could never predict. And so we had built, again, a legal construct that was sort of just really, really solid. And, then you also have insurance, to protect you from the things you possibly couldn't have seen coming. And you just try your best. And, so it's kind of a function of all of that, right? Good regulatory support, good legal support, good insurance, using outside doctors and physicians who are trained in these capabilities and these clinical protocols, so that we don't get ourselves in trouble, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of going on that, I imagine when you were getting people involved and going on the fundraising, going through the fundraising stages and things like that, people probably asked you, how is this different than Theranos? Or, oh man, is this another Theranos that's coming our way? Like, I guess I'm curious how you mitigated those critiques. Or I realize you've hit on some of those points already, that, you use separate labs, you're not building, in-house machines and things like that. But I'm wondering if there were any other like ways where you kind of distance yourself from that company.
Yeah, it's funny. In 2017, that was such a big deal to investors. And kind of now since COVID, like 2020, I've been talking to investors, and it's like that Theranos word doesn't exist anymore. I think COVID really got a lot of people believing that small volume testing platforms, can work. Of course, COVID was a, kind of a plus minus sign on a nasal swab. So that's very different than a quantitative, cholesterol panel. But still, it instilled confidence that small volume testing could work. No, the way we did it back in 2017 was, it's kind of like own the narrative. I think about 8 Miles rap battle at the end. Have you ever saw that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And at the end, Eminem comes out and basically says everything that they're going to say against him, and then they have nothing to say, right? And so I learned that as an investor pitch, we were getting hit with all these questions, and so I rejigged the investor pitch so that slide one was, we are not Theranos. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. And it was amazing because then they're like, all right, well, we got that out of the way. So now let's chat. So it's kind of like coming out and owning the narrative. And at first, as a early entrepreneur, you're kind of like, you want to sort of let them guide the conversation. But the best thing I ever did, again, someone told me, was just go in and own the narrative. And so what we talked about was independent doctors. We would use third-party labs that were at least CLIA certified, that had clean audit histories. We would define a clinical protocol that would be independently verified by our advisory board members, that this test, this biomarker, these reports, this language is applicable in a clinical setting. We would even strive to publish in peer review, and we did. We put our data methods and know-how on our first test, celiac disease, into CCLM, which is a global clinical chemistry magazine. So basically, we listed out those bullet points and more around how we would strive to be different and better. And that went a long way because these investors became aware that we were aware of all of those problems. And so they became more comfortable right off the bat.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I'm curious, it sounds like you've been through a couple of rounds of fundraising now. It sounds like, I'm curious where you are at as a company, like kind of what stage you guys are at, both fundraising and then just even in general of kind of in the grand scheme of things, and then where you're kind of hoping to go in that next step, if you will.
Yeah, we've done a couple of rounds of fundraising, kind of like the seed and Series A type. So that's where we're at now. The next one is probably in the next 6 to 9 months, around a growth round, as the economy sort of figures itself out, as COVID really does finally hopefully go away, as people turn to wellness, as we're seeing more and more people are becoming proactive and wellness oriented. We think there's just going to be a huge takeoff of at-home testing to support all of those use cases. And we'll be doing a growth round, probably by or before at the end of Q1 of next year. And I think from an industry perspective, this is the start of consumerism of healthcare. It's probably going to take a decade when you think about it. It's going to start with some easy wins, like what the wearables are doing and helping you just get better sleep, maybe exercising a little more, and just being able to track some of those super basic things will make huge improvements in a lot of lives. And then augment that with what we're doing, kind of standard testing, your annual testing that maybe most people don't do, but now, they almost have no excuse to. It's affordable, it's at home, it's accessible, it's, really small volumes. So you might see more and more people do those things so they can get in front of things like high triglycerides or high A1C. And, I think that's where it's going to go over the next couple of years. Then you'll see all of that data smashed together and, some kind of Apple Health Kit mobile app that just gives you this beautiful experience where you're measuring all of this stuff and getting telemedicine specialty care, on your iPhone. And I think that's just it's just going to keep evolving, like a classic Apple, right? It's like Apple 12, the iPhone 12 is always that much better than the previous, but it really wasn't, right? It was just a little bit better every time. And I think that's what you're going to see in the next decade, is like this healthcare at home thing. Every year is just going to get a little bit better. And then one day you'll look back and be like, I can't believe I didn't have that, so long ago.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I agree with you. I think it's going to move. I don't think telemedicine or, at-home medicine is really, I think that's something that's going to probably be a positive, byproduct of the pandemic. I think both at-home testing, you're even seeing new gadgets where people can, doctors can do physical exams via telemedicine visits. So I think you could even see these virtual clinics, or at least hybrid virtual clinics. And I think something what you're providing is, a critical step with that. You can't do doctor's visits, maybe unless you're like a psychiatrist or something, without, monitoring lab values. I'm curious how, as patients and as their physicians try to, more closely monitor and get more data, are you seeing some labs being drawn more? I mean, obviously, if it's normal, it's normal. There's nothing really to follow up on until the next year. But are you seeing more kind of regular monitoring going on, with some of the, now that you've made this much more available to patients at home? I would imagine that would kind of help with, if they're doing a different diet or something, or taking a new medication, being able to follow up, like you said, biomarkers for whether that's working or not.
Well, the one thing what you said there about testing at home, I just saw a doctor say something on LinkedIn, which was labs are a way of proving something, of diagnosing. And so if you're talking to a doctor who doesn't have your labs, they're basically hypothesizing on your health. And I was like, oh, that's actually really interesting, right? So a doctor's statement without a lab is simply a hypothesis. A doctor's statement with a lab is a diagnosis, right? So it was just an interesting way that somebody had said that on LinkedIn. But more broadly, to your question, where we're seeing the biggest uptick in terms of people testing and the quantity of tests and the frequency change is really in kind of cardiometabolic, because people are starting to realize that they can improve that at home, through a combination of diet, lifestyle, exercise, and sleep. So think of kind of, again, your classic lipid panel, bolt on an A1C, a CRP, an insulin, and all of those kind of work in conjunction with each other. And as you start to exercise, as you start to tackle that A1C, maybe reduce your carbohydrates a little bit, reduce your sugars a bit, glucose goes down, trends down, A1C trends down, insulin trends down, then your insulin resistance improves. So we're seeing a lot of people want cardiometabolic centric panels. And where people used to test that maybe once every other year, you're starting to see people say, hey, I wouldn't mind testing that annually. Or if I'm going aggressively on an improvement program, I'd like to test even twice a year so that I can really see and track those improvements. So again, if we continue to, make that test easier to use, continue to try and drive that cost down, you'll see people start to monitor that more, because those markers will respond in 90 days.
That's amazing. I mean, I think it's like you said, it's taking a more proactive, kind of what we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation. So much of healthcare, as firsthand, is so reactive. It's such a, it's a kind of a buzzword, or that's kind of beat dead at this point, but it's still what relevant is the sick care model versus the healthcare model. I think this really helps with the healthcare model, people taking control of their own health and then, monitoring. And it's the thing about one lab value is it's one point in time, versus if they can have like regular follow-ups like this, or have even just like you said, maybe more than just once a year, I think that could really dramatically help kind of steer the ship, as far as, because like we were talking about again in the hospital, I mean, we're measuring these values almost every day, and some patients multiple times a day. And that, like you said, lab values are a definitive diagnosis, or a definitive picture of what's going on with the patient, and those are guiding management decisions. So why not do this from the same thing, from the home base, if you will?
Yeah. Well, you hit a nail on the head there. I was talking to a cardiologist who said, if we lived in a perfect world where tests were cheap and data was, all integrated, they would want to start measuring lipids at about 21 years of age, so that you get a baseline of what that person is. And then what matters less than the absolute number, of course, if the absolute number is really high, then you've got a problem. But what you want to see is sort of the trajectory. And if, somebody's got 10% higher, let's say you're just 10% higher than me, but your line has been flat for 20 years. Whereas maybe when I was 21, mine was 30% lower, but now I'm catching up to you. That my curve is actually worrisome more so than yours. But if you just measure the data point last year, yours might come out more worrisome. So you got to look at the trajectory of these things, right? A more obvious example is if you just measure a plane in the sky, you don't know if its nose is going straight into the earth or if it's flying flat. So you really do have to take at least two data points spread out over a couple of years. And especially in these heart disease related ones, a lot of times the symptom is a heart attack, right? You don't feel anything until it's almost too late. So really we do, holistically want to get people testing more frequently. It doesn't have to be an Imaware test. Just go get that earlier baseline test. Now you got something to work with, and now you can track over time, right? So I think like the next generation of people, coming up are more proactive, are getting these tests done earlier. It's amazing. I've spoke to a lot of people who have said they've only had one lipid test done in their entire life. There's a lot of people in that boat. And so, yeah, those are the types of people we want to help get more data to.
Yeah, I think you hit on some really good points there. I mean, one, the trend for sure. Again, in the hospital example, we're constantly looking at trends. I think it's one of those, is it trending down? Is it trending up? What's it doing? And I think you make an excellent point that, if someone's staying at the same value over 20 years, versus someone who's steadily going up and up and up, I think that's something to pay attention to for sure. I think also it also probably makes it more real for somebody. Like you said, right now, what happens, unfortunately, is maybe they get one lipid panel. It doesn't look so great. Their doctor tells them to change their behavior. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And then 5-10 years later, unfortunately, they're in the emergency room with chest pain, and they either, they have a heart attack. And, that may be the impetus at that point to change. But, what would have been better is if, they had more access to being able to, see that, this is actually real. This is, like you said, you can't, unless you have a heart attack, you don't feel it. It's kind of too late at that point. So I imagine this also being a great driver for behavior change, if you will, in some ways.
Yep. And, I'm glad we live in a world where we're so connected, and you're seeing more and more experts come out and become digitally connected through health coach networks and things like that. So people are getting the best advice, and that advice is scaling out there, which is great. So, yeah, I think this is just the start of kind of, like I said, the consumerization of healthcare and significantly more focus on prevention versus sort of that sick care, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it also goes along with, I've had some friends that use like the Whoop or the Fitbit, and, like it tracks your sleep. And like if they went out, partying one night and they see like how much that, affected their sleep, and they think, oh man, like I didn't realize that, it's, alcohol affects my sleep. And then I'm like, yeah, guys, like it's not, may have had a good time that night, but it's not ideal for your sleep pattern. It at least, like, I think wakes people up to a little bit about like, what's going on inside of them versus just, when things are, kind of at that end point, like you said.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I wear the Whoop, and now I've learned, if originally when I didn't know this, I would have like 4 cups of coffee after going out the night before. And then I'd be like, oh, I feel fine. But that's caffeine doing what caffeine does, which is blocking my body's desire to go to bed. So the next day I'd stay up till midnight again. And now the Whoop's like, no, go to bed at 8:30 tonight, because you had like, zero recovery the night before. And cut that coffee off, stop that last cup at noon, and go to bed properly. And then, you wake up the next day feeling like a champ now. So yeah, these are little insights that, we didn't know about 5-10 years ago. We just sort of said power through with caffeine, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you also hit a good point there that, feeling good and having good health, it's a lot of like good steps over time, and I'm even learning this, myself as I get older and try to take better care of myself, is it's a lot of small steps done right. It's not, one big step one day and then you're done. It's and I think, Imaware and other products like that, we're kind of giving you more data, more knowledge, if you will, of how your body is doing. Definitely help play a role in that for sure.
Yeah, you're totally right. A lot of little baby steps, and it doesn't mean you can't, go and, break the mold or have fun or go out one night. It just means if you're going to do that, you'll be aware of the impacts of that, right? And then you may do that a little less frequently, or you might balance it out better, right? Or, 1 to 2 glasses of wine instead of, 4 or 5 shots of Mark Cuban's tequila.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we touched a little bit on this in the conversation, but I guess, what are, I know you offer a lot of labs, like you said, in cardio metabolic area, men's and women's health, which I think is also critical to people monitoring their own health and just giving them a sense of their health. What, we touched a little bit on the immune markers. What are kind of some of the labs you're really excited about that you're hoping to roll out maybe in the next, 6 to 12 months or so, that you're kind of testing out? If you can comment on that, maybe I realize maybe sometimes some of those you may not be able to, but.
Well, a more broad thyroid panel, and hormones in general. Insulin is just becoming prevalent as a marker to measure, and it causes insulin resistance, which drives up all these other conditions. So kind of bringing those markers into more of our mainstream panels, to add that, augmented information. Like I mentioned, it's not so much about the one marker in one point of time. It's like, let's take a look at a family of markers and how they're sort of messing up with each other, right? So as, for example, most people probably know this, but maybe they don't, but as cortisol goes up and you're in this fight or flight and you're anxious and stressed out, for men, that's bad because that actually affects your testosterone. And so testosterone starts to, go down, and then you start to add some weight, and then maybe your triglycerides go up. So, these things sort of snowball together. So the thing we're focused on at Imaware is actually measuring, kind of multiple biomarkers, multiplexing that together so that you can actually have a little bit more of a total picture. We did initially start out kind of with those one or two biomarker tests, and they just weren't offering enough breadth and depth of data. So a majority of our tests, for the kind of coming year or two, is going to focus on expanding what can be done out of a patient sample, right? So if we're going to ask them to Lancet themselves and to draw out a sample, that's the perfect time to draw out two more biomarkers, right? So we're going to definitely try to make sure that we optimize these panels for the blood that we are asking for those patients. And then I think the one that I'm really excited by is we are working with a partner where I think we can bring some rapid testing to market over the kind of 1 to 2 year time frame in some of these areas. So imagine that you could do a rapid test for inflammation, or a rapid test for triglycerides or LDL. And, that you could just get the answer in 15 minutes. And if it's positive, then you follow up with a quantified, lab or Imaware report to figure out what your number is. And those tests could be, $19 instead of $800, so that you can, as a person trying to understand if they even have a health concern, they could test more frequently. So kind of think about bringing rapid tests and lab tests together to play this role of screening and diagnostics together. We're definitely going to be focused in that area to help customers get access to that kind of right test at the right time.
That'd be amazing if you could have an answer like that so vast. I mean, even if you even the best labs out there, you gotta, often I think wait a day or so even to get kind of your results. So yeah, I think, giving yourself even that immediate feedback, and especially in this day and age where everyone wants their answer yesterday, I think I'm sure you would have a lot of interest for that as well. And then again, like you said, hitting on the, insulin and thyroid and things like that. I think, again, these are just, common, but, problems that people, I think, I'm sure like endocrinology, I mean, they're always looking at different, lab values, hormone levels, all that type of thing, all those types of things. Helping manage those care, I think would be paramount to, helping those doctors, take better care of their patients for sure. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's and like I said, I think in the grand scheme of things, we're just getting started. There's so much data to unlock, and there's so much. Like, one thing I think people are realizing more and more is we've been treating the biomarker, right? So if you have LDL, here's how we're going to treat LDL. We're going to lower it and do this thing. But what if the heart was multifaceted and it was a combination of 20 markers and the trends on those markers, and it included inflammation and genetic risk factors and cholesterols, and we could actually measure the cholesterol, right? That you probably know this, but LDL most of the time is calculated by taking total and subtracting HDL and a ratio of triglycerides. But what if we could start to really measure that stuff in our body? We might realize that some people, have good cholesterol measures and numbers, and other people actually who thought they had good numbers may not have such good numbers, right? So I think the idea for us is just to keep driving into measuring more and more and more. I think we're going to unlock, back to your earlier question around trends and insights and data. I think we're going to learn a lot about where we used to make sweeping generalizations. Like BMI is under attack right now, that's as not being necessarily a good biomarker to look at and make opinions on. And I think you're going to see the same thing with some of these other biomarkers, where we just used to say globally, like, if you had this LDL, you were in trouble. And yes, we definitely have to manage cholesterol, but I wonder if there's more data we can use to make better decisions or more personalized decisions around your heart care, right?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I'm wondering, have you guys looked into any of these like cancer biomarkers out there? Obviously, like PSA, is a major one, but I think like PSA is used, not only as a screening, but as a treatment response, and I think, there's other biomarkers out there, as I'm sure you're aware of, that, cancer doctors will use. I'm curious if you guys have, looked into working with those at all. Cause I think, having cancer patients they have to go through enough. If they could just, test those at home, that would make, I think, one, just a better experience for them. And then if, help, probably would be more helpful for their doctor as well, and also improve compliance with following those trends, like you said.
The cancer word scares me a little bit, in the sense that there still is tests, like no test is perfect. None of them. They're going to have, sensitivity and specificity or precision and accuracy problems, 1 or 0.1%. And in an at-home setting, especially if somebody's got a fear of cancer, I think right now for Imaware, we think that patient is better handled with the care of a physician in person. Cancer is, it's hard to know what stage you're in. So I just think there's so much unknown there, but I love what's happening in liquid biopsy. I do think there's going to be a time where maybe we can partner up with a liquid biopsy company that has developed excellent science, and maybe we can help deploy and scale that out into an at-home setting, potentially, like you said, at first for monitoring, and then potentially for screening, or flip it around and say, hey, this is a screening test only. And everybody who's positive actually gets a guaranteed consult, where physicians will call till you answer. Like, we're going to have to build a protocol that's, to your earlier point, like very compliant, above and beyond the legal minimums, because that would be, it's just a scarier word. And we'd have to have absolutely top tier service for that. So, yeah, but I think, again, you're going to see more and more. The more we know about these conditions, the better we can bring things into the home. So,
yeah, definitely, definitely. So as we close things out, I just want to give you a chance to tell both, I guess, customers, then also physicians, like how they can, begin using this, both, patients themselves, and then how physicians can, recommend it to their patients, and how it all works with, signing up and, getting your labs drawn and everything like that.
Yeah, we're at imaware.health. We got great SEO at Imaware, or at home testing. You'll see Imaware. It was actually a patient who named us. I was telling the story about building health awareness, and the person said, "Oh, I'm aware." And so, that was how we got named. It was great to be named by a patient. In the coming year, we're going to be making connectivity to several healthcare systems that we know are deployed across tens of thousands of physician offices, which means Imaware could be available to order inside of a physician platform like that. So think of a requisition today for some physicians, telling the patient to go to a LabCorp Request draw station. Now the requisition could say, hey, if you want to pay the copay of $35 for the at-home convenience kit, you'll get an Imaware kit. So we're going to try and integrate that into the experience so that patients have choice in that matter. And of course, we're working with health systems who want to deploy this more globally into monitoring scenarios, so that patient doesn't have to drive for an hour to go and do a standard test. So we've definitely been working with health systems to help them think about deploying, proofs of concept like that.
That's very cool. Very cool. So Jani, I ask every guest this. I want to ask you this. What do you do to find that balance when you're not busy working on building Imaware? How do you find that balance, if there is one?
Kids are great. I got a 2 and a 5-year-old. So spending time with my family is always an amazing thing. We're here trying to continue our health and longevity so that we can be there for others. So definitely love time with my kids. Exercise, the Whoops got me back into exercise. It tells me that I, shouldn't be sandbagging my exercises, which is great. And, I tried to get out and travel in the last year since COVID, just to reconnect with friends and family. So yeah, just really focusing on the friends and family part right now.
That's awesome. Well, Jani, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day. And I really commend you and your colleagues. I mean, you guys have really built a great company here. I mean, and especially I commend you for, going above and beyond the efforts to make sure that everything's, compliant and by the book, and just providing, top quality care to these patients. I really commend you guys for that. So thank you again.
Yeah, well, thanks. It was such a great chat. I really enjoyed this conversation. So, and if if there's anybody in your community who wants to reach out, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. My name's Jani. I'm probably the only one there, or you can find me on the Imaware website too. But I love chatting with people who want to get into the business, who want to, physicians especially, who want to become more digitally engaged, or start to share their knowledge, or other entrepreneurs who are just looking for guidance on how to crack into healthcare. So yeah, I'm definitely here for the community.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. We appreciate it.
You got it. Well, have a great day, great rest of the day, and we'll talk soon again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DaVinci Hour podcast, presented by DaVinci Academy. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your podcast platform of choice to catch the latest episodes. Please leave a comment or a review and share it with a friend. Lastly, you can find all of our podcasts, video courses, and books on our website, dviacademy.com. Thank you for listening.